Thank you for joining us today on Staying Ahead of the Curve. Today is a very special edition. We're about 24 hours removed from the new Department of Labor advice rules. And joining me now to gauge reaction is Fran from Institutional Investor. Thanks for joining us on the show today.
Jeff, thank you so much for having me here today to talk about one of my all-time favorite topics in the 20 years that I've been reporting on pensions and retirement.
So you have been reporting, as you said, for 20 years on this very important topic. This is a landmark change. I wanted to see what, from your perspective, you as a person who's been covering these issues, what's your perspective on these changes?
Yes, well, I've been writing about pensions and investing for 20 years. This topic has only come up in the last 5 to 10 years. In the years that I've been a reporter, a financial reporter, I have written about, let's say, what pension funds are investing in, what asset classes, should they be investing in international assets. I haven't written as much about the 401k world and the world of the small investor until about 5 or 6 years ago when it became a really burning issue.
And certainly, at the end of the day, defined contribution plans, as we call them in the industry, are really about education, communication, and the end user, the employee. So this really marks a sea change, the first time since 1974's passage of ERISA, and most recently the update of the Pension Protection Act. These are some really landmark rules for the people that are going to be providing advice and guidance and education to many individual investors within retirement plans.
Well, that's right, Jeff. So in 1974, then Senator Jacob Javits of New York finally brought ERISA across the finish line. It took him 7 years to get that passed. And I think it's taken that long or even longer for Phyllis Borzai, the Assistant Secretary of Labor, to get this fiduciary rule, also known as the conflict of interest rule, across this finish line. It's been a very long, hard push for her because she's really concerned about the small investor, not the people who have pension executives and experts investing their pension money for them, but the average worker who has a 401k and doesn't really know how to invest it.
So as a consultant, one of my charges is to work with clients and help them develop communications and education strategies. They're partnering with vendors who may have individual representatives who are providing investment advice or guidance. This could potentially change that particular aspect of the services that record keepers are providing. It's also going to really evolve the process, I would imagine.
Yes, well, there's two issues, I think, on the plate when we talk about fiduciary and conflict of interest. One is the small investor and where they're going to get advice from, and what kind of advice. Will it be unconflicted advice, or is it a sales pitch? And the other side is the majority of our readers at Institutional Investor are financial services professionals. There are people who manage pension money, people who manage retirement money, insurance executives, and we care about them too. We want them to have a strong and healthy business. So the tension of the conflict of interest rule is making it work for the small investor as well as for the big financial services firm. That was the goal, I think, of this rule.
And this rule really makes it less of a sale potentially and more of a consultative type of arrangement. So reading we haven't read completely the 800 pages of rules, but it seems to imply that it's all about educating and making sure that people have the right suitable product. They're getting the advice and guidance that they need in order to make the best prudent decision. And it really turns that away from a sale per se, quote unquote, and more towards consultation.
Right. Well, also, to put it in perspective, I think it's really important to know that the 401k only came into existence after ERISA was passed in the late 70s, and it only started to take off well into the 80s, almost till the 90s, before people were really investing in 401ks. So they're investing in 401ks, and then they separate from their company. They either leave or they retire, and they have a nice little, if they're lucky, a nice little pot of money that's their nest egg. So besides Social Security, that might be almost all they have if they're lucky to have that. So the question is, what do they do with their 401k? That's what started to get Phyllis Borzai, the Assistant Secretary of Labor, concerned and worried about someone who saved a pot of money for 30 years. What happens to that pot? Now, I think that if you've watched TV for the last few years, you'll have seen commercials that are well intended, but they're really focused on the businesses that are saying, what are you going to do with your old 401k? As if it's old, meaning it's no good anymore. And the question is your 401k no good? Should you roll it over into IRA? And if you do roll it over to an IRA, which is an individual retirement account, how do you do that? Who helps you do that? And whose interests are at heart? Is it the interest of the salesperson who's trying to sell you the IRA? Or is the salesperson really concerned about whether that IRA is going to continue the work that your 401k has done for the last 20 or 30 years?
And one of the things as a consultant, we're working with plan sponsors, we see a lot of participants leaving the plan, moving over to an IRA, but you really have to think about the suitability. Obviously the intent of the employer to keep people in the plan, because when you're within a plan, retirement plan, and we're not advocating for one particular position or another on this program, but in terms of being in a retirement plan, you have access to cheaper investments. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, if you roll out into a IRA, as you're talking about, we're seeing people move out and go into what could potentially be more expensive products. So I think it really could, from our perspective, create conversations with clients to say, hey, what's the intent here? Is the intent for people to leave the program and move out of the plan, or maybe it's better that they stay in the program? And I think that's part of that consultation that they're going to get from advisors.
Right. So let's move to this thought that clearly this fiduciary rule is aimed at 401k investors who roll their accounts into IRAs to protect them. That's one of the main themes. And such that even Labor Secretary Tom Perez got behind it, and it escalated it up to President Obama, who has been behind it, and that's another reason why it finally saw the light of day. But I think that here's the tension with this rule. So financial services industry is concerned that they're going to be either disintermediated or have their whole business model changed. And the truth is, we're in the 21st century and everybody's business model has changed. It doesn't matter whether you're a journalist who has a completely different business model, or a taxi driver who has Lyft and Uber and all those other companies trying to steal business away from them. That's the American way, right? We're here to have competition. So I think that there was a very incredibly cynical message that was given to the American public by the financial services industry to scare them into thinking that the smaller and mid-sized investor would never have any more advice. They'd be up on this high diving board looking down into the ocean of products and not knowing what to pick, where to put their savings. It was cynical because it's not true. I know that the financial services industry is very capable of creating new products. I've seen it for 20 years. Wall Street, insurance companies, mutual fund companies, they love to create and invent new products for investors to save their money in. And if something changes in their environment, they're going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure it out. And that's what's going to be happening now, partly because of the fiduciary rule. That's not the only thing, though, that's affecting change in financial services.
So you talk about evolution. It's 2016. How do you see advising? You cover this issue.
Right. So I see advice playing out from one end of the spectrum to the other. Obviously, people who have a lot of assets will stay with their financial advisors, or they won't, but that's a different story. I see the new investor, someone who's just taken a job, and if they don't have a ream of student debt and they can actually put a few pennies away, there are instruments that already exist for them to select to put their money in where they don't have to think about who's managing their money. It's done for them. So that's one thing. That's within a 401k. But there's also what's called now robo-advice. So that's basically companies like Betterment that have put together algorithms, quantitative means of taking what the investor wants to invest in and figuring out what that should be based on their risks, the way they feel about their financial risks, how much money they have, do they want to put it in stock? There's help out there. But then there's other kinds of help where you can interface with a real human being and you don't have to be rich. There are companies like Financial Engines. Financial Engines' median account is $58,000. And about a quarter of their investors have less than $25,000 Now, if that's not a small saver, then I don't know if we're just talking about people with coins in a piggy bank. But there are companies out there that are coming up with really creative ideas before the fiduciary rule was put in place. Technology, like anything else, is making it possible. And we're going to have, technology is going to make it cheaper and easier to get high quality, unconflicted advice. And that's going to happen with or without the fiduciary rule. But it's very nice to have a fiduciary rule just in case we're still seeing salespeople who do not have their clients' best interests at heart. There will always be some of those.
Fran Denmark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeff.